Great. So I am Ethan Arenson. I am a prosecutor with the Computer Crime and Intellectual Property section at the Department of Justice. I'm going to serve as the moderator today. And my background with identity theft is really twofold. One, from a policy and legislative role. We do a lot of work at Maine Justice talking about how we should prosecute identity theft, what the penalties should be, if the statutes fit the crime, that kind of work. And then there's the other part that I work on, which is the actual prosecution. So finding the criminals, bringing them to justice, sentencing them. So that's my background in identity theft and my perspective. I want to go ahead and introduce each of the panelists real quickly, and then we'll jump into their views on what is going on in the marketplace right now, what is the identity theft to fraud cycle that they're seeing, and then we'll talk about how we can disrupt it and what some new ideas are to get there. So first, to my left is Mike Cook. Mike is the CEO of Exor Data Exchange and formerly held senior management roles with Experian and with American Express. His company's focused on enabling data sharing for risk management and protecting consumers and businesses from identity theft and fraud. Next is Chris. Chris is the Senior Vice President for Client Solutions and Marketing at IDology, which provides technology solutions that verify identity and age for organizations operating in a customer not present environment. Next is Michael Magrath. Michael is a Director for Global Standards in Healthcare Information Security and Privacy at VASCO Data Security. Michael's an expert in the field of healthcare identity management and is focused on delivering identity proofing and strong authentication solutions for provider and patient applications. And finally, at the end, John Cannon. John from the UK. He is the Fraud and Identity ID Director for Call Credit Information Corps Group in the United Kingdom and formerly led Equifax ID and fraud team. So I will kick it off with the first question, which is asking each of the panelists who really represent a bunch of different sectors of the economy to talk about the identity theft to fraud cycle that they're seeing. What are some of the trends, emerging threats? What is the state of play out in the battlefield as you see it?
And I'll start. So for us, we see a lot of fraud stemming from data breaches. There's been a lot more data breaches come out. Fraudsters have gotten a lot better at targeting consumers with phishing attacks, targeting even VC communities with spear phishing. So I think some of the new fraud that we've seen recently is coming from a lot of data breaches, the increase in data breach. We serve financial services and communications companies, so the couple interesting things that we've seen lately. Synthetic fraud, we started to learn about synthetic fraud back about 2003. The way to solve synthetic fraud is by link analysis, and a lot of that's been done. So synthetic fraud has kind of changed, right? And instead of trying to do new apps and create identities, what at least we've seen in financial services is that they are starting to add authorized users to the card. And when they add an authorized user to the card, they let that kind of age, and then it gets a FICO score. People tend to pre-screen it. People offer credit, or even they can use those cards to kind of get even more additional cards. So synthetic fraud, I think that's kind of morphed over the last probably 3 years, and a lot of it, I think, is from data breaches. And so that's increased. In wireless, in communications, there's always been new app fraud, right? Because people want to steal the device. That's where they make money on the device. We've seen some of that in communications move to small business risk, where instead of just getting one phone, I can get 5, 6, 7, 8, right? So in small business risk, fraud solutions are kind of not really developed that well yet. We've also seen account takeover, where in wireless they didn't have a lot of account takeover, but we've seen that increase. Because people now will go in, take over an account, add additional phones, change the address, and get the phone shipped home.
Chris?
I think we're seeing a lot of similar things at IDology. We see a lot of data breaches have definitely caused a lot of problems for everyone. We see what we call the perfect identity. These fraudsters now that it's so easy to collect data and to purchase data on the dark web, that now they, have your information. John, our CEO, spoke earlier today, and we basically assume at IDology that everyone's data has been breached at some point in time. And, they have your name, your address, your social, your DOB, so it's very easy for them to get through systems that are just doing basic data matching. And so we see that, we see these attempts come through the system on a regular basis from the data breaches. We can kind of correlate directly when we see there are certain indicators that we see in our system when they're, for example, when the Anthem breach occurred, there were certain indicators in our system that it takes about 2 to 3 months for us to start seeing that come through our system, but we were able to see that and recognize that and stop that. But on top of that, the data breaches and the data is so readily available in the dark web. Also, synthetic is another thing, just like you said, that we're seeing. And I think that that's one of the biggest problems that we need to solve today is the creation of synthetic identities. We see this a lot. We see it coming through the system a lot. And the way that we see the cycle of all of this happening, we work also in financial services, but we also work in the tax industry, and we're just coming out of tax season, and that's very top of mind for me right now because it's like a battle during that time of year. So what we typically see is we'll see someone come in and file. They may have stolen an identity. They'll file a tax return. They always keep it under the radar. They keep the numbers very low. But you may have someone who's collected 50 identities, and they file tax returns for those 50 identities. They might put them onto a prepaid card, or they might open up a bank account, and then they funnel the money through a P2P company. So we see this, and because we're working with all of these companies, we can see it go from the tax return all the way through whatever mechanism or device they're going to use to funnel it out, to get it out of the system. So synthetic and data breaches, huge problem that we see, and we definitely need to do some things to resolve those issues.
Okay, so I'm going to be talking to the group from a healthcare perspective, and really focusing on medical identity theft. So we have, I think all of us have probably been victims of identity theft at one point, a credit card getting stolen, et cetera. But medical identity theft presents a whole other ball of wax. So this is when your identity is compromised to obtain medical benefits, getting treated, could be getting drugs, and those go in your name. And unlike financial, I think a lot of people are aware of this, but unlike financial services where my credit card gets stolen, I can call the bank, fill out a form, it's forgiven. Those processes do not exist in healthcare today. So when your identity is stolen for medical purposes, you may not know about it for a long time. And reading those EOB statements that you get from your insurance company, many people don't even know how to read them. Other people will just toss them. Word of caution, you may want to take a good look at them because that's where that will probably be the first place that you'll be aware if your identity's been compromised. So breaches are a huge concern in healthcare. You can't read the news without hearing about a healthcare breach. Just heard about Anthem. It was 80 million people. Last year there were 16 million people were affected by healthcare breaches, and a lot of those have been hacking events. And not only hacking events, but unauthorized access. These could be insiders within a hospital or a health system that may just be curious, or they may have a nefarious directive. So people will access this information, they'll download it. The information is available on the dark web. There's kind of a good news and bad news. I've been in this business for a while. 5 years ago, a healthcare record was worth $50 on the black market, one record. Okay. Today, I read the other day, they're going for about $1.50. Okay, there's a surplus. When you have 135 million records out there and are posted on the dark web, the price goes down dramatically. So that's a bad thing. And I can go on for the 45 minutes, so I'm going to pass.
John.
Oh, please do. So I should explain. So I wear two hats in our organisation. So I work for a business in the UK, which is probably best known for being a credit reference agency. So my day job, I run the fraud and identity part of that business. But I also wear a practitioner hat in the organisation because we've got a large consumer base of individuals that come to us for information. They protect their devices, they protect their identity. So I have the headache, as many practitioners have, of deploying strategies to detect and prevent fraud in our organisation. I think if I was to give you an example of some, really following on from some of the other comments really around data breaches. So some of you may be familiar with the TalkTalk data breach that happened at the end of 2015. It was huge news in the UK. I think it sort of spread around the world as well. Within about 24 hours of that data breach occurring, the CEO of that business went public and looked to drive consumers towards the call credit service to help to sort of protect their identity. So it's things like if your identity then shows up somewhere else within the network, you can be alerted as a consumer to that actually happening. So credit report monitoring, dark web monitoring. If I was to sort of describe the challenge that I face and how that's changed over the sort of last 10, 15 years, I kind of think, when I think in my sort of day job, we've spent a lot of time studying human behavior to base some of the solutions to protect against fraud around. And in particular, the human brain is quite a powerful identity verification solution. So you go about carrying out identity checks throughout your life every day. You'll have done it here today. When you arrived at the conference, you'll probably meet people you've met before. You'll use stored information about that person to authenticate them. You'll meet people you haven't met before, so you might get introduced to somebody via somebody who you know, someone who you trust, who introduces you to that person. So you carry out these checks, and we've used that as a methodology. And if I think about the challenge today, if you take a situation where you walk into work every day, and you probably walk past someone at the desk and you say, good morning to them, your brain's using information to sort of suggest, okay, I've got information about how they look, they're sat at their desk, they're in the right location, the right time of day. If overnight that person had sort of dyed their hair from black to blonde, you'd probably notice, you'd probably do a double take. And the reason for that is your brain's actually kicking in and saying, something's not right here, something's unusual. You might engage in conversation, and then you probably realize this is the identity you would carry on. Take that to an extreme example. You're on holiday somewhere, and you see that person from work, and they're at the end of the bar. You'd do more than a double take. You'd probably look at them quite hard, and you might actually not go over and sort of engage in conversation. I've done that so many times when I've seen people out of context, and that kind of relays the sort of challenge we see today in the digital economy. So 10, 15 years ago, we interacted with consumers. If you think of a bank, they would come into a branch, so the location, the time of day between 9 to 5, all controlled, and they wouldn't expect an instant response. Today, that same consumer wants an instant response, can come from anywhere in the world, can be 24 hours a day, and that places a lot of strains in terms of trying to actually establish if that is the true identity or not. So I'll probably leave it there for now.
Thanks for that, John. So we've talked about the challenges, the struggles, how difficult it is, what the marketplace looks like right now. Let's talk about solutions. What are some of the creative, innovative ways that we can cut down on identity theft, make it more difficult for the criminals to steal identities and then monetize that information? And Mike, if you kick us off.
Sure. A lot of the panelists talked about data breach, and one of the things that we've been wanting to do probably for about the last decade is to put some technology together that would take breached information from the dark web or breached information from, say, an Anthem data breach, and that you would match that to companies that are at risk, right? An at-risk company. So, think about it, right? If I lose data, who gets hurt? Bank of America, AT&T, right? Capital One, Sprint. So we thought if you could take that breached information and make it available to at-risk companies at the point of a change of address, at the point of, a new application, that you could help those companies detect which compromises may be causing the most fraud for them, right? And it was beyond theory. We had done some interesting things against the Veterans Affairs data breach when they lost that years and years ago. And so today, we've taken that compromised data. So compromised data off the dark web. We have 2.5 billion records, a bunch of other compromised data. And recently, we were able to do a pretty neat analysis where we matched fraud information from a few sizable banks, top 4, and then we matched fraud information from a couple big communications companies. And what we found was that all the breaches are very different, right? How fraudsters use the data is extremely different. Most of the data breaches, even though, of course, you think data breach, my data is going to get lost or used, 3/4 of them aren't used to really perpetrate any fraud, right? And how do you know that? Because you compare it to the average fraud rate. The other 1/4, the fraud rate's higher, right? And so if you drill down into it, you can detect, here's the data breaches that are being used to perpetrate fraud. We had tags for account takeover, digital fraud, new account fraud, both for communications and financial services. So we could even detect within a data breach, right? How is that being used? It's being used in the banking environment to perpetrate account takeover fraud, right? And then we would look at the next breach and we would see this breach is being used to perpetrate new account fraud in the wireless space. So for me, I think the biggest thing that we can do as an industry is start to couple compromised data that's been lost and either being sold on the dark web or like Anthem, it's their information. If we can start coupling that data with at-risk entities that are doing transactions where those fraudsters are coming, I think that will actually take a big bite out of fraud in the U.S.
Great. Chris?
Yeah, I love that. I think that collaboration is definitely key in being able to stop this. We do have a consortium at IDology that we use that our customers contribute to, and we can start to see, as I mentioned before, the fraud move from company A to company B to company C. I really like your idea of bringing in the breach data too as part of that. I think that's really really good, and I think that we do have to be creative. I mean, how many people here, just by raising your hand, how many of you actually in your company go into the dark web on a daily basis and look to see what's happening with either your customers or your company? Right, so there's probably 3 or 4 or 5 people here, right? If you're not doing that, you should be doing that. I spend a lot of time in the dark web, and more than my mother would probably like for me to say that I do. But when you go in there and you can earn trust of these on a forum, man, these fraudsters, they're willing to tell you anything you want to know. They love to collaborate. They are collaborating so much better than we are as businesses and corporations. It takes a committee of 12 people in a business to make a decision on something, and it might take you 6 months to get it done. Whereas they can collaborate on a minute or hourly basis and say, hey, let's shift and do this. And they're so willing to share with you their tactics. I went in once as, hey, I'm new at tax fraud. I really want to get into it. And first they said, that's so passé. Like, that's old news. We're moving on from tax fraud. We're moving over into, something else over here. But they said, hey, if you really want to get into it, let us help you, right? So they were helping me get into tax fraud, and they were helping me, and it was just amazing how collaborative and how friendly they all were, right? I mean, I know I'm a little bit naive in there, right? But they're creative and they find really unique ways to be able to. I wish that they would just use their knowledge for good instead of evil, because good gracious, what they could accomplish if they would do some good things. But there was an example that I gave Ethan a couple of weeks ago that, they had obtained one of the contacts I had in there had obtained an entire list from Kentucky that was anybody under the age of 18. It was their social security numbers and their profile. And they sold this database, and this database was perfect for synthetic identities or stealing these identities because they didn't have a credit profile yet. So they used these minors' information to go create credit or to create bank accounts and to start building credit. And I mean, they do this stuff on a daily basis. It's pretty incredible. And I think that we should be collaborating as well as they are collaborating, because they're not stopping. They're not going to stop, and they have no rules. There's no boundaries. They don't have regulations to follow. They don't have, corporate rules or compliance. They're just, and a lot of this, you guys, is not about the money that they can get. A lot of it is just because they get pleasure out of sticking it to the man. They just want to have bragging rights that they breached a company or that they, brought down a government website. It's not always about the money. And so I think we have to shift our thinking to be just as creative as they are to be able to fight the problem. And the other thing that I'll say in terms of synthetic IDs, present company aside, because you're in a UK company, but our credit bureaus in the US, man, you got to stop. You got to stop. If there's anybody from a bureau here, you got to stop. You're the problem. You're allowing synthetic identities to be created, and you're not, and it's just flowing through the systems. You're not doing anything to stop it. It has to start with you. You have to be the ones to help solve this problem.
Great, thanks for that. Mike, in the medical field, talk to me about solutions.
Sure. So a couple of things. So just going back to the medical identity theft issues, a couple of things I left out is, compromised data. If somebody assumes my identity, gets medical treatment, or vice versa, that you could bring in misdiagnosis, allergies, wrong prescriptions being, wrong medications being prescribed. They could kill people. All right, this is a serious issue. So I know that at these conferences it's let industry decide, but when it comes to healthcare, I'm a very big proponent of HHS, the Office of the National Coordinator of Health IT, and CMS, Medicare, to mandate stronger authentication into these networks that are being breached. Most of the breaches that occur are compromised credentials. Those compromised credentials are username and passwords. They're not cutting it. And years ago, the argument was, well, it's too difficult. Well, you know what? It was then. But now there's just so many frictionless, easy to use two-factor authentication methods. Some of them are outside. My company provides them. I mean, it's a lot easier now, and we have to protect these networks. I mean, I was thinking about this over the weekend, and you can't. A car manufacturer cannot make a car without seatbelts. It needs directionals. It needs turn signals. It needs headlights. Okay, this is healthcare, and these are lives at risk. And things need to change, because getting a letter in the mail saying your healthcare record's been compromised and we're going to give you 1 year of credit monitoring, that isn't going to cut it anymore. So one other thing I want to add to this is that us Americans, we all sign the HIPAA forms when we go to the doctor. There's two components to HIPAA. There's a privacy rule and there's a security rule. The security rule was drafted in 2003. Okay, a lot's changed in 2003. I had a really cool flip phone. I thought I was the king because I had broadband. Okay, no more dial-up. And the world has changed, and I was very outspoken at a conference that was hosted by HHS that they need to update the security rule to protect us and really bring strong, trusted identities into the healthcare side, not just on the patient side, but the providers as well, and anybody touching an electronic record. So I'll leave it at that.
Mike, let me just follow up with that. It does seem like the healthcare industry is a particularly soft target. We've been seeing ransomware attacks against hospitals starting early last year. The WannaCry attacks from last week in large part targeted hospitals. Why is that? Why are hospitals still running Windows XP systems? What needs to change there?
A lot of it is budget. Okay, so in the financial sector, on the security side, a bank, they'll devote, I think I've read statistics, it's like 13 to 14% of their IT budget goes to security, or their overall budget goes to security. That's pretty significant. A hospital, it's about 5%. And it's really do we get the new MRI machine, or do we deploy strong authentication and identity proof people to get rid of passwords? That's really a big issue. It's the resources. And one of the things that I hear in the healthcare industry is we don't have the cyber experts. They're just not there. There's a lot in Washington, but you go into the rural areas, there aren't too many cyber experts in rural Kansas. So those are big concerns.
John talked about solutions.
Yeah, just in terms of the UK market. So you may have heard over the last couple of days in some of the sessions talk about the Verify program in the UK. So this is a federated identity program. So when you engage with the UK government, you select from one of, there's currently 7 identity providers or IDPs. You verify your identity once. And then the intention is every time you come back to interact with the government that you use that identity token to interact. And as that process rolls out, that identity will be used as you go about your journey through private sector as well. So that's a core focus in terms of the UK. I think in terms of technology, we've heard a lot about distributed ledgers over the last couple of days. I think not wanting to bring that back into the conversation necessarily, but that's been a core focus. But I think the point I would probably like to make is that certainly an issue I see in the UK market, and I don't know if this translates into the US market as well, but I'd be interested to hear people's views, is the widening gap between the speed of technology and regulation. And if I give you an example, in the UK, we have a number of regulations that impact identity, probably the biggest one being the money laundering regulation. And regulated firms such as ours have to carry out certain due diligence checks on customer identity when they first enroll into a process. And the regulation talks about applying risk-based approaches, but it actually, rather than talk about identity and just leave it as identity, they actually go to the point of actually talking about name and address. So in the UK, name and address is pretty much the main sort of attributes that I use for identity. So they talk about the need to validate identity from 2 data sources for name and address, name and date of birth. Now, when you try to relate that into some of the technology that you hear and some of the latest technology, it doesn't translate very well. So you end up with poor compliance departments trying to catch up and sort of shoehorn latest technology. So things like location, behavior, etc., don't fit into that model of the need to go and validate name and address. And I think you heard Ed Snowden yesterday saying, I don't necessarily fully agree with what he was saying about KYC checks and AML checks, but he does have a valid point in that some of it has become tick box exercises to meet the regulation rather than making use of the actual real groundbreaking technology that's there that could be deployed to help solve some of these problems.
If there are questions from the audience, please go ahead and grab a mic. I'll continue to ask the panel questions, but if folks want to have their own, please jump in. One of the questions that I get a lot as a federal prosecutor is, what can consumers do to help themselves? Is there any self-help? Is there any protection? Is there a consumer education problem here that consumers can do something to stop their own identities from being stolen? I'm a bit of a skeptic here, but I'm interested in hearing the panel's views. What can I, as a consumer, do to protect my identity from being stolen by criminals?
For me, it's stop clicking on things. I mean, I don't even know if we can educate consumers well, because we helped a senior executive who used to work at a credit bureau who had gotten breached because he clicked on something. So, it's I think for me, it's really just these phishing attacks have gotten better, and consumers just don't know. Don't click on that. Yeah, you can get it through your phone. Be very careful. So that, for me, that's probably the best thing consumers could do.
Is there a way to get there? I mean, we tell people don't click on things all the time, and they still do it. We get phished at the Department of Justice all the time, and people click on these links. So how do we convince consumers and educate consumers to get them to the point where they actually get the message and don't rush to click on the first email that they see? Is there something more than education? Teach it in high schools? How do we get there?
From a UK perspective, I mean, and this sounds a bit strange for somebody who works in this industry to say this, but consumers in the UK don't really care about identity, if I'm honest with you. They care about the things that identity enables them to do. So I want to buy a house, I need to get a mortgage, I need to prove my identity, I want to buy a car. So all of these things, so the identity is an enabler in the background, and there's certainly a perception that if someone steals my identity, then the bank will pay me the money back. So I'm not going to lose out on this. And it's kind of starting to change in the UK market very much around that. Some of the banks now are sort of saying, well, no, actually, we're not going to pay you automatically. We're going to make you prove what you've actually done as part of this. So I think education is an absolutely critical thing, but it's actually getting consumers, finding what's the thing that motivates consumers to be interested in identity. Because I can bet you once the identity has been stolen, they suddenly become interested in it and want to do something about it.
So that's a really interesting point. Maybe we can talk a little bit more about that, because I had my credit card stolen 3 times last year. Probably at this point, it's a minor inconvenience, if that. I know I'm going to get reimbursed for all the charges. I know I'm going to get a credit card FedEx to me within 24 hours. This has really just become a fact of life and not a big deal. Is there too little of a penalty there? Is it just so easy that consumers are not even worried about identity theft because the consequences are nil?
Yeah, I think so. I think that, it is pretty easy, like you said, to get reimbursed on your credit card. Not so easy on your bank account if your bank account has been compromised. But, I think there's not enough education out there about how to protect your identity, and especially for young folks. I mean, we're in the age of social media. People put everything about themselves out on social, and even so much as going to take a picture of their license when they get their driver's license for the first time, right? Like they're excited, so they post a picture of it. And maybe it is in school that we need to start educating a little bit sooner to say this is your identity. You need to protect it a little bit better than what we're doing.
And I think that becomes even more of a challenge when I look at my kids, so I've got 4 kids, and I look at how quick and eager they are to open apps and just give anything away and not check anything on there. I think educating at an early age is really important.
Mike Magrath, what about in the medical field? Should I be refusing to give my Social Security number to my doctor? Are there ways that I can protect myself as a medical consumer? Or is it just part of the machine at this point and it's hopeless?
I think you could refuse. Okay, when we go to the doctor's office, the first thing they ask for is your driver's license and your medical card. And one of the things that the fraudsters do is that this is documented, organized crime was doing this. They put somebody at the front desk in a doctor's office, they'll answer a help want ad, and they'll make 2 copies of the driver's license, one for the file and one for them. So it's really, really difficult to protect you. I mean, I think we all know that. The ramifications are much different, though. I mean, if it's my credit card, yeah, I make a call, and it's really not an inconvenience. If somebody steals my identity and files a tax return and gets a nice tax refund, I'm going to have a tough time convincing the IRS that money should be mine and not theirs, and they're going to pay twice. I don't think that's going to happen. In the case of medical information, people that have gotten their identity stolen, they've had to make lots of calls and pay money to the insurance companies. This has been done before. So it's a huge inconvenience on the medical side. And again, it could cost lives. So but to answer your question, I really don't know, the silver magic bullet to protect us all.
So let me ask a question near and dear to my heart. What is the role of law enforcement in breaking the cycle here? Are criminals afraid of being prosecuted for identity theft? Do state and federal law enforcement take this problem seriously? Or is this still viewed as a petty offense, and unless you've stolen 2 million credit cards, you're probably going to get away with it?
Can I answer that one?
Please.
So from personal experience, this is kind of I'll make it very brief, but I had a fraudulent charge on my credit card once, and I live in Fairfax County, Virginia, so I called the police department and I said, I got this fraud. Oh, what happened is I found on the credit card statement, it had the number of who made the charge, the merchant. So I called the merchant, and it was some drug company in New York, in Manhattan. I called them, and I said, who made this charge? And they gave me the address of where the shipment was made. So then I looked up the guy's name, I got his number, and I called the guy, and I said I was a Department of Justice person or FBI or something like that.
Don't do that.
Isn't that fraud?
Just to scare him. But and I had him shaking in his boots. And then I called the local police department, and I said, I have this guy, he's here, you can have him. And they're like, well, you have to come down here and fill out a form and do all this. And it was a major hassle. I mean, it just wasn't convenient for me. So nothing happened to them. It would have been a huge inconvenience for me. So it is a slap on the wrist scenario where, I guess in a large case where you guys would get involved, that would be different. But if it's, a few people that are getting affected, I don't think you guys are going to get involved at the Justice Department, correct?
That's probably right.
And I think that, a lot of times it's what gets reported is something pretty small, so it's not big enough to be investigated. But what's the problem with that is that it could be tied to other larger things, organized crime or human trafficking or even terrorism. There could be, it could be the link into something larger. But I also think that the penalties are not as stiff as they need to be. I've got I wouldn't call him a friend, but I've got a reformed fraudster that I talk to occasionally, and he was on the FBI's most wanted list at one point in time for some of the antics that he did. And while he was informing for the Secret Service, he was also still committing tax fraud at the same time because he knew he could get away with it. He got busted, had to serve a little time, got back into it. It was just such a way of life for him, and the penalties were so small. He did a couple of years in prison and got out on good behavior and went right back to it as he was informing for the Secret Service. So, we have to probably think about, are we putting forth the right punishment for this, and what are the dollar levels that we're willing to dig in and research things for?
Yeah.
Question right here.
First of all, my wife's identity got stolen. Exact same thing. I traced the person who actually her phone was stolen, and I traced the person who ended up with the phone. And it went from Connecticut back to Massachusetts, back to and I found it. We told the police everything we found. They didn't do anything.
You guys are like really good investigators. Have you thought about?
I'm in the search industry, so.
Yeah.
But so we had the exact same thing. But the question I had for you guys is that the trend now is this data loss blackmailing, where you only have to pay me $300. Okay. I mean, I haven't personally seen it. I've heard a lot of people told me this. Well, the company will pay $300 because $300 is like, it's a write-off, right? But, they do that a million times, and that's $300 million. How do you stop that? Because the inconvenience is so small that the company is actually contributing to the problem.
Don't use Windows XP.
What's that?
Don't use Windows XP for a start.
But, by the way, I don't.
I think it comes back to consumers themselves. I mean, it's very difficult to educate consumers, right? I think, everybody, even me, I'll get something in and I'll almost click it and go, oh, wait, don't do that. So I don't know if you can get around that. I think the ransomware piece is a little frightening, right? Because these guys, like you were saying, they don't have any regulations, they don't have any rules, right? So you pay me $300, I don't completely fix your system, right? And then I call you a little bit later and go, hey, it's $100 this time. And then let me put you on a monthly plan, right? Yeah. So I think that the ransomware thing is kind of frightening. I think if I were to get attacked, I would just say, hey, my data's gone and I got to get a new system.
Well, I would do the same. I'm not sure most people do, though.
Yeah, I mean, my own personal thing is some important things I will back up in the cloud on different sites. Some things I'll back up to Google, some things I'll back up to Microsoft or other providers. If they get hacked, then I'm kind of SOL. But if somebody came in and did ransomware on my own PC, I'll say take it. My data's safe.
But you bring up a fair point. If the penalty here is $300 for a big sophisticated company to spend the time it would take just to back up their data, which is perfectly backed up, that's going to be a lot more than $300. So
that's why
it's
I'm talking to you about it. I mean, how do you fix that problem? You don't even have the victim on your side, really.
so the only thing we can do is go after the criminals and try to find them, which is not an easy thing to do, but we have successes. But it gets very tricky when companies come to us for advice and say, what should we do? Should we pay these criminals? And that's a very, very difficult question to answer. There are business realities there, but there are also concerns. If you're going to pay this person who you don't know, who is at the other end of the line? Who are you paying, and what is that money being used for? Those are real concerns, and there's just no easy answer there. Maybe we can talk a little bit about tax fraud, because this is an area that just fascinates me, and I think a huge amount of federal tax dollars that people would not imagine are just going out the window to foreign cyber criminals. I think if the general public understood what percentage of the U.S. budget is just going out to foreign criminals, they would be outraged. My sense is the IRS has gotten better about this, that it was the case maybe as recently as 5 years ago. I would see money mules here in the United States that would have 7 or 8 different transactions, IRS refunds, put into their account in 7 different names, because the refund transfer would actually list the name of the taxpayer. And the bank wouldn't bat an eye and would allow those deposits to go through. it is my sense that the IRS has gotten better about this, and that has caused the fraudsters to now attack the states and start doing the same thing with the states. Is that consistent? Chris, maybe you've got some expertise here. Is that consistent with your
Yeah, very
experience?
much so. Yeah.
What's the answer there?
I mean, we're on the front lines of this during what we affectionately call fraud season. So we're on the front lines of this, and we definitely had a quieter year this year. I'd like to think that we also played a part in. We're working with all of these e-filers and tax issuers. So I'd like to think that IDology played a part in that as well. But I do know that the IRS has gotten much better. They are also collaborating better with these companies, the prepaid card companies and the tax filing companies. And I think this year was a better year. I think you'll see when the results come out later that that the fraud has gone down this year.
And what about the states? Are the states
The states are still they're still the underbelly, the weak underbelly. They've got a long way to go because every state wants to do their own thing, and it's like let's find a good way to attack and approach this. But I definitely think that the states still have a long way to go.
Great. All right, why don't we close with just a closing statement from each of you? You want to just give your perspective on maybe where we're headed and just sum up from what the takeaways from this panel could be? Can you start us off?
So for me, I think we're going to move away from point solutions and probably have a little bit more consortiums where a lot of the data may be shared, device ID may be shared, IP address, email, location, all of that kind of at one place. I think one way to do that, it's interesting, Capital One came out today and talked about how they're going to make their data available through an API, right? Which I thought was great. I think I feel a little bit differently on who owns data. I think that banks, communications companies, those guys own that experiential data, right? The behavior of the consumer. I think consumers own PII. So I love to see a bank say, hey, I'm going to monetize my own data, and I'm going to do something good, which is help stop fraud. So I think we'll see probably more of that in the U.S. It's a little bit like in the U.K. what you've got, but I think the government's run it there, which could take us forever to get there. So I think that we'll probably see a lot of that over the coming 12 months.
Chris?
Yeah, I agree. I'm definitely excited about more collaboration with industry, and seeing companies come together and work together. We see this a lot today, just with the solution that we have, where we have customers that are fierce competitors. They fight each other to the death to get customers, but their fraud teams are actually coming together and working as a group to make sure that we're stopping the fraud. And so I think consortium data collaboration is key if we're gonna fight this problem. And just sharing and being creative. Like, be more creative than the fraudsters. Move faster. Stop with all your committees and just go. I don't want to say it out loud, but we just get stuff done. We've got a term called GSD at IDology. That's our method, and it's get stuff done, but the stuff is another word, and I'm not going to say it out loud. But just go get stuff done, Yeah. A CEO, right? But they're in the back, guys. But no, just collaboration. Move fast, and make sure that try to stay 10 steps ahead of them if you possibly can.
Mike?
Well, at this conference and at a lot of identity conferences, you hear a lot about trust and digital identities and making things secure. And we're getting there. What I see right now is you still have stovepipes. You might have a trust framework here, you have another one here, but those two trust frameworks don't necessarily trust each other or go by the same rules. So there really needs to be interoperable digital credentials. So if I'm issued a digital credential from one party, I can use it on Intuit to file my taxes, and you may have a digital credential issued by another party that you could use on Intuit, and Intuit, being that relying party, would be able to trust it regardless. We're not there yet. The NSTIC initiative, that's really the grand vision. Still got a ways to go, but we're getting there, hopefully.
John, you get the last word.
Yeah, I think I would, on top of the discussion about consumer education piece, I think also doing more to disrupt the cash out method is a key focus. So when I think of the issue associated to money mules, particularly now in the UK, it's a huge problem. The cash out method, and that goes right from the point of, you see these adverts advertising for get rich quick schemes. So make £1,000 working from home. All you've got to do is receive some money into your account and then send it on, or take it out and send it somewhere. More can be done in terms of right from the advertising through to the banks monitoring that sort of information to do more to disrupt the cash out methods, because the fraudsters are not really interested in identity, they're not really interested in all these things, they're after the cash at the end of the day. So if you make it difficult for them to cash out, some of these other problems around identity fraud start to become less appealing to them, because they don't need your identity if they can't cash it out at the end.
Great. I'd just like to thank the panel. It's fascinating, and thank you all for attending, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you.